Okay, hello and welcome to video number 8 of these GCSE Sociology Revision videos from me, Ben, at All Sociology. Today's session is all going to be on education, and specifically we're looking at the role of processes that take place within schools. So we're going to look at things a bit like labelling, self-fulfilling prophecy, anti-school subcultures, and also things like the hidden curriculum and the role of banding, setting, and streaming. Now, hopefully you will be able to see me. I'm now up into my little corner, up in my little perch there where I should be. And this is what we're going to cover today. So those things: labelling and self-fulfilling prophecy, the hidden curriculum, the role of banding and setting, and pro and anti-school subcultures. And what ties all of these things together is the idea that effectively all of these things can happen in school and they can have an effect on how you achieve or how you experience school life. So without further ado, let's kick into some labelling and self-fulfilling prophecy. Before we do that, in fact, let's talk a little bit about all of these things very briefly. So teacher expectations, what we mean by that is how teachers see you and how likely they think you are to be able to achieve something or do something. Labelling is the process of teachers literally attaching a label or a name or a tag to you and sort of seeing you either as a bright pupil or perhaps not so bright pupil, or someone who is dedicated to their work or not dedicated to their work, those kind of things. When you label somebody and you continually label someone either positively or negatively, that label can become believed by that individual, and then they can go on to live up to that label, and that's what we call the self-fulfilling prophecy. When we consider what the school's actually like, many people would argue that schools are middle-class institutions. And so often we think of the values, the class and the culture of schools being very middle class. And if you're working class, that might cause a bit of a clash between those two almost cultures and ways of doing things. We've also got to think about actually what you get taught in your subjects and which subjects you pick. That will have an effect on what you come to know from school and how you end up doing. But also, and probably more interesting, I suppose, is I mentioned this in my previous video when I talked about the role of theories and what they see as the role of education. When we looked at the hidden curriculum, both from, well, in fact, from a functionalist, a Marxist, and a feminist side. And hidden curriculum is anything you learn in school that isn't taught in lessons. So the classic examples would be things like punctuality, obedience, respect, the idea that there's a hierarchy in school. I always do that, hierarchy in school. Schools run on competition, those kind of things. But also we're going to look today at school subcultures. So what we mean by a subculture is a smaller group of people with their own norms and values that often are at odds or certainly different to the wider culture. So when we're talking about subcultures in school, we're basically talking about groups of kids who have different values, norms and ways of doing things to the actual school itself. We're also going to mention about how groups and how learning is actually organised in school. And we're going to look at in fact, we'll look at 3 concepts: banding, setting and streaming. Now, effectively, what you need to know is that banding and streaming are basically the same thing, and they are where you put pupils into ability groups for all subjects. Setting is just where you get put into ability groups for certain subjects. So the classic example is like maths. So if you're in the top maths set, you have been set. If you are in different ability sets for ability groups for every subject you take, we call that either banding or streaming. And then finally, something I'm not going to talk about massively today, but of course, one of the things that's going to affect how well you do in school is the type of school it is. Is it a state school, so like an academy, a comprehensive, a faith school, even a grammar school, or is it an independent school? So are we talking private schools, or even we're talking public schools like Eton and Harrow and Radley, those kinds of ones, okay? But let's get into talking about labelling and self-fulfilling prophecy. And I've actually put a picture on my video today, and that man there in the baseball cap looking very dapper is Howard Becker. And the reason I've got Howard Becker up here is because he is one of your main people you're going to talk about if you ever get a question on labelling. Now, labelling, as I mentioned previously, is like prejudging a person by attaching a name or a meaning to them. And so in schools, we often think about teachers labeling pupils as able or as high ability or as low ability or as having behavioral problems. These kind of things is what we mean by when we talk about labels. Now, when I mentioned self-fulfilling prophecy earlier, if you come to label somebody either positively or negatively and you continually attach that label to them, the idea is that label will eventually become believed by that person. And we call this a self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's just assume, for instance, you are negatively, or teachers negatively labeling a student as badly behaved and someone who's not going to achieve very well. The idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy is that that label will eventually become believed by that person, and they will not want to achieve, or they feel they can't achieve. But it also works the other way around. So if you label someone positively, that could have a positive effect on them, and they could come to believe that label. In fact, there was a really interesting study done in the 1960s by two sociologists called Rosenthal and Jacobson, who looked exactly into this. And what they did was they basically told some teachers that a bunch of kids, like a random bunch of kids, that one, are going to be geniuses. And they watched how the teachers then basically treated them differently according to those labels, which were completely false, by the way. They just picked these kids at random, not very ethical. And the teachers lived up to those labels. They continually labeled those kids, and the kids lived up to their self-fulfilling prophecies and actually did better purely by the process of labeling and self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, when we come to talk about labeling and self-fulfilling prophecy, what we're really talking about here is an interactionist idea. And an interactionist is a different type of sociologist to like a functionalist, feminist, or Marxist, because what they're interested in is not the big scale, what's going on in society. They're interested in smaller interactions between individuals. So how does a teacher interact with a pupil, for instance? Now, whilst these guys are not Marxist, feminists, or functionists, there are certainly some links in their work, and we can link some of the interactions work on labeling to things like class and gender and ethnicity, and I'll do that a bit later on. So when we come to talk about our sociologist, there we go, Howard Becker, whose eyes I've kind of crossed out with my big load of words there. Becker basically said that teachers label pupils according to what he considered to be the ideal pupil. So every teacher's got in their head, according to Becker, the ideal pupil, which is based on someone who works hard, who behaves well, and is looking smart and dresses smart and those kind of things. And what Becker said basically is that the middle class pupils are closest to this image of the ideal pupil, and working class pupils are furthest away. So that's going to basically dictate that teachers are going to label pupils in a positive way if they're middle class, and negatively against the idea of the ideal pupil if they are in the working class. But also we've got another interactionist called David Hargreaves, who was doing some work. Becker was an American working in the 70s. Hargreaves was British working in the 60s. And he basically found out that effectively the same kind of idea as Becker, that teachers tended to label those middle class pupils as cleverer than working class pupils. And that might be due to, again, things like their work ethic, but also down to things like their accents, their appearance, how they dress, how they conduct themselves, those kind of things. So how can we criticize the labeling theory? It's very much used often in sociology. I mean, one of the things we can say is that not all labels that are bestowed on pupils actually end up getting believed and taken on. Lots of people actually reject those labels to prove teachers wrong. So if you say to someone, oh, you're not ever going to achieve anything, some kids are going to go, do you know what, I'm going to prove you wrong. Okay, so that's one idea. The other thing we can talk about with interactions, and I mentioned this earlier because it's labeling as an interactionist idea, their research tends to be quite small scale. So whenever we take, we sort of read about or learn about an interactionist theory or a study, we have to take it with a pinch of salt, because we need to question its representativeness. So it's not going to be representative to a whole population, for instance. Often we're just talking about very small groups, sort of, 10, 20 or so. The other thing, it's not very reliable because it's very difficult to go back and repeat this again. And one of the reasons for that is because it's so subjective. So there's no objectivity, there's no real answer. How do you know how someone's labeled someone? So it's very interpretive, very subjective, and also very small scale. So that's interactions and labeling and self-fulfilling prophecy. Let's have a look at something I've talked about in a previous video. In fact, the last video I did, which was on theories of the role of education, I mentioned the hidden curriculum, and I mentioned that both Marxists and functionalists have well, in fact, feminists as well, but I'm going to focus on functionalists and Marxists, have a lot to say about the role of the hidden curriculum. Now, just to recap what it is, it's the process of going through school and learning stuff that is not learned in lessons. So we might think about the way that we're socialized into the norms and values of the school, like obedience, or this idea of a hierarchy, the fact that competition is something that happens a lot in schools. So think about, at my school, we have like a house system. So every kid's like split up into a different house. They compete against each other. We have sports days. We have all of these kind of things, right? But also think about the ways that we're socialized into our gender roles, for instance, through the ways that teachers have expectations of us, or how they might label us, or how we might have particular subjects that are gendered in a certain way. Okay, so when we talk about the hidden curriculum, we're talking about stuff that we don't learn in lessons, but that just kind of happens as a process throughout our school life. And basically, we've got three different views on this, depending on which theoretical approach you take. Functionalists always see the hidden curriculum as positive because it teaches us those valuable life lessons that we're going to need to learn in order to get on in society. So, for instance, if we don't know the value of punctuality in school and we turn up late for work, we're probably going to get sacked. Okay, so it's that kind of thing that they're coming at. It's a positive experience. We need to know these things in order to get on in life. But Marxists and feminists take a very different view. They both see the hidden curriculum as negative. Marxists would argue that the hidden curriculum just perpetuates, which means continue or maintains this idea of class inequality and the idea that the working class are just going to need to be prepared for those working class jobs, as was discussed by Bowles and Gintis. Or we've got the feminist argument that basically just perpetuates gender inequality, for instance, through almost like pushing us towards different subjects based on our gender, those kind of things. So how can we criticize this idea of the hidden curriculum? Well, first and foremost, this idea that schools transmit these values and that we just all suck them up as like pupils isn't necessarily true, because if we look at the role of, last video I talked about Marxist Paul Willis and his study of, again, a very small like interactionist kind of study of about 12 lads in the 1970s. Those lads rejected school values. Okay, so we can't just say that these values get built into our brains and we don't have any kind of control over what we take and what we leave from them. So we can definitely say that these values are not always kind of sucked in. They often fail in terms of hitting their target and often are rejected, particularly if we take the arguments of Willis and the working class lads from his study, Learning to Labour in 1977. So let's have a look at banding and streaming and setting. And the fellow there who you are going to need to know if you talk about banding, streaming and setting is Stephen Ball. And basically what banding and streaming is banding and streaming is basically the same thing. It just means, as I mentioned earlier, putting you into ability groupings for all subjects. So no matter what collection of subjects you do, you'll be in ability groupings for all of those. And schools don't do this as much, but they used to do this quite a lot. But something that schools do still very regularly, particularly in subjects like maths and science and sometimes in English and languages, is what we call setting. And this is just where you're put in ability groups for some subjects, and maths is the classic example. Now, when we come to talk about banding and streaming and setting, there are huge overlaps here with the ideas of labeling and self-fulfilling prophecy. And one of the reasons for that is that when teachers label a pupil as such, they will then automatically be put into, so if they label someone as bright or perhaps not as bright, they will be pushed into one of those sets or streams according to that label teachers have. And why this is important is because, as you'll probably know, if you are in a lower set for maths, for example, you're going to be taking a foundation paper. Meanwhile, if you are in a higher set, you're going to be taking a higher paper. And that basically determines what grade you can possibly get. Because if it's anything like it was when I was at school, if you did the foundation paper, I think the maximum you could get was a C, or might have been a B or something like that. So the role of teachers in selecting who is in which streams and bands is really important for the overall outcomes and achievement outcomes that students will get at the end. So let's have a quick look at what Stephen Ball actually said. He basically said that those kids who were put into the top and the bottom bands responded very differently to being labelled as such. They knew they were in top or bottom bands. As a result, the kids in the top bands performed really well, like pushing themselves to prove that they were able and capable of being in that top set or that top bands, and those at the bottom kind of just gave up effectively because they knew they were in the bottom set. The behavior wasn't particularly good and all of that kind of stuff, and so they decided that, well, actually, self-fulfilling prophecy, I'm in the bottom set, I'm never going to do particularly well at maths, what's the point in trying? Now, Nell Keddy is another sociologist, conducted a very similar study to Stephen Ball's, and all she basically said is that students, it sounds obvious, but it's kind of important, that students who are in different bands are taught differently, and so they perform accordingly in those exams when they come to sit them. So for instance, you might not be stretched as much in a lower tier or a lower set or lower stream subject as you might do in a higher tier, and as a result you're not going to stretch yourself in those exams. So how can we criticize this? I mean, like, one way we can talk about is like the fact that streams aren't like particularly fashionable in schools anymore. We don't tend to put kids into streams, but what we do still do is sets. But what we can definitely say is that bands and sets don't always equate to that achievement, and some do not determine which exam papers students are actually sat for, but some of them obviously do. Now, again, what can we do with this? Again, it's kind of interactionist kind of research. So again, we can talk about it being very small scale and therefore not representative, not reliable, and based too much on subjectivity. Here we go. Right, pro and anti-school subcultures. I've got this fella here with a lovely head of hair. Is Paul Willis, who I've mentioned a couple of times already, not least in this video, in the previous video where I discussed the Marxist view of the role of education. Pro and anti-school subcultures, what are they? They're groups within schools with their own norms and values. So a subculture is just a smaller group within a wider culture with its own norms and values, often different to the wider culture. So when we talk about an anti-school subculture, what we basically mean is groups in school of pupils whose values go against the school. So, for example, poor behaviour or mucking about. A pro school would be the opposite. So this is where the values chime with those of the schools, and you might exhibit really positive model behaviour in order to put yourself in that pro school subculture. So it's all, I mean, being really, really candid about this, anti-school subcultures are the kids who are a bit naughty and who aren't really doing much. Pro school subcultures are your nerds and your geeks, basically. Sorry, don't write that in your exams. It's not PC. But who can we talk about when it comes to this sort of like feature of or process inside school? Well, Paul Willis, of course. Now, Paul Willis in 1977 went and studied 12 working class lads in Wolverhampton, and he saw how they rejected the values of the school. The school was middle class, the lads were working class, and they had their own set of values that didn't chime with those of the school. So there were things like having a laugh, mucking about, not doing their homework, taking the mick out of people, those kind of things. And they're very much not the same values of their middle class school. So what Willis basically argues is that through this kind of constructing this little group of people, you come up with your own rules of the game. And for them, there's more value, or more like, I suppose, like, what's the word? Like, oh man, what's the word? Like, there's more kind of credibility in the values of their own subculture. So for instance, mucking about, having a laugh, than there is in actually doing what the school used to do, which is working hard and getting on, those kind of things. Now, the other one we can talk about, I mentioned previously when it was talking about labelling, was David Hargreaves. And all he said basically is those pupils who were labelled as such by teachers, they were placed into lower streams. And then as a result, then they turned to anti-school subcultures themselves. So it was almost like the school had pushed them that way. And the further they got and the further they believed their labels and their self-fulfilling prophecy, the more they thought, actually, I'm not going to get out of this. I'm going to start my own little group. So in criticising the subcultural view and the pro-school and pro-school and anti-school subcultural view, firstly, we can say that membership of us being a subculture doesn't always determine your achievement. For instance, you know, just because you might have a laugh at school, because you might muck about or whatever, doesn't mean you're going to fail your exams necessarily. I mean, it probably won't help, but it doesn't determine that you're going to do really badly. And then also, again, we've got that question here about how relevant are these studies today? You know, Hargreaves was writing in the 60s, Willis was writing in the 70s. These are both getting on towards 50 years old each, and an awful lot has changed in that time. So how relevant are these things still to us today? So looks like I might get through this one in 20 minutes, which is awesome. Let me just recap what we've done today. I talked to you a little bit about the processes that go on in schools. So what can affect you, your experience, and potentially your achievement. We looked at the role of labelling and self-fulfilling prophecy, where teachers might label you or bestow a tag on you that's going to determine how you feel about yourself. We talked about the role of the hidden curriculum. We looked at the ways in which what we learn, not in lessons, but in school, can have effects on us, and different sociological theories, functionalism, Marxism, and feminism have different views on it. We considered the role of banding and setting and how the teaching and learning in your school is actually organised. And we looked at the ideas of Stephen Ball, who said that those pupils who are put into lower bands are going to be behave as such, and they're going to kind of live up to that statement. And that Nell Keddy argues that students in lower bands will basically just not achieve as well and won't try as hard. And then finally, we finished off by considering the role of pro-school and anti-school subcultures by considering the work of Paul Willis. So that's me done. Again, I'm back. Hey, there we are. And so just to say thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you found it helpful. I'm going to go over a little bit over 20 minutes, but that's not too bad. If you found it helpful, if you liked it, drop a like on it, subscribe to me, go visit me on Instagram, allsociology, or go and have a look at my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/allsociology. If you've got any questions about any of this stuff today, I know I've gone really fast. If you have got any questions, just drop me an email, hello@allsociology.co.uk, and I'll be very happy to respond to you. All right, so that was video number 8, processes in school. The next one we're going to be doing is all about achievement in school, and that's going to be the penultimate one of these videos. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you again very soon.